In the town I'm living in, we must stay 6 feet apart. So we live on Zoom and Skype, touching only our sweetheart, seeing friends we can't afford, even though they live next door. So we burrow in our caves, zooming in to virtual raves. We all live in apartment quarantine. We watch our giant screen, an isolated scene. We'll be here till the last line will be, until next Halloween, or till there's a vaccine. And we go to see Times Square. It's so blessed, and no one's there. But we're better off at home, watching movies like Home Alone. All the while out in the street, there are people without a home. And in jail they're crowded in, call for their release, pick up the phone. We all live in apartment quarantine. We watch our giant screen, an isolated scene. We'll be here till the last line will be, until next Halloween, or till there's a vaccine.
Welcome everybody to People's Strike, General Strike 2020. We're joining you from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York City, Hartford, Connecticut, and expect to be talking to people around the country and around the globe. And I'd like to hand it over to Matt Meyer.
Hey there, exciting to be here May Day 2020 with a special 1-hour program on dealing with schools, dealing with prisons, and the school to prison pipeline as dealt with in this hyper period of COVID-19. We're going to start off in Philadelphia, looking at the school situation from the point of view of some intense resistors, building alternatives, handing it back to you, Wendy, and to the Philly school situation.
Thank you, Matt. I have with me today Tonya Bahwill, activist, former city council candidate, absolute warrior woman, and Dan Reyes, both of whom are members, also warrior dude, Dan Reyes, both of whom are members of the Working Educators Caucus in Philadelphia. So I'd like to start off by you guys giving us a little context of We Caucus and the struggle around public education in Philadelphia. And Dan, do you want to go first?
Sure thing. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Dan Reyes. I'm a high school teacher in Philadelphia. I teach English and social sciences to high schoolers in West Philly. A little context about the Caucus of Working Educators. We are a caucus within the Teachers Union, the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, which is a local of the American Federation of Teachers here in Philadelphia. We formed about 5 years ago in response to the need to build up rank and file power within our union in a way that was not just fighting on the narrow terms of our contract over wages and benefits, but also really thinking about how we're fighting for broader working class solidarity with our students, with their families, and using the union as a vehicle for winning really transformative demands, from fighting the school to prison pipeline, from fighting against layoffs, and in general, beyond that, imagining schools as emancipatory, liberatory spaces where human development is centered instead of just simply disciplining the future workforce, which is really important in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the poorest big city in the United States. It's also the majority Black and brown city. Those things are, of course, intimately connected because of the structures of racial monopoly capitalism. And so as a result, our schools have been chronically underfunded for generations. I think one thing that's worth mentioning is that public schools have always been in a position where the purpose is to discipline and segment the workforce. But because our working conditions as teachers are intimately connected with our students' learning conditions, and many of us don't get into this job to discipline the future workforce, that brings up really important contradictions where teachers and students' interests become deeply aligned in wanting to fight for both fully funded schools, but also schools that center human development. So Working Educators grew out of that, especially due to the 2013 budget cuts that were pushed towards us by both the school district and the city government, as well as the state government in Harrisburg. We're hearing now about billion-dollar budget deficits. This isn't the first time we've heard about that. In 2013, they also announced a billion-dollar budget deficit. And this was also in the context of a state takeover of the school district. So austerity in Philadelphia within our public schools has been commonplace for a long time. But over the past 20 years has really ratcheted up with things like the state takeover of the school district run by the School Reform Commission, as well as a contract freeze where teachers did not have a new contract for 4 years. That really matters because even in the context of uneven funding, the teachers union contract is a major way that we can make an intervention to start fighting for our schools. We've seen that in LA, we've seen that in Chicago, that even if we know that the contract isn't the be all end all, it is an important way to start organizing among the rank and file in our teachers union, also putting forward common good demands for students and families within that contract. So Working Educators grew out of these conditions. We've been fighting within our union and in coalition with student groups and family groups and other workers across the city to fight for the schools that our students deserve. Some of the highlights from things that we've done, when we were in a contract freeze, we organized a sick out of 1,000 teachers, which essentially forced the district's hand to reopen contract negotiations with our elected leadership. We've also contested for leadership of our union twice on the basis of saying that we can't just have a union that sees itself as just providing services to its members, that sees its role as only negotiating for wages and benefits. We need a union that is willing to fight for the working class of the whole city, and one that runs in a bottom-up democratic fashion that really prioritizes member engagement from the school building on up, recognizing that that's where our power actually comes from. Having a contract is great, having a good contract is better, but if we don't have school level organization that's really engaging every single member in a vision for what our schools can be, both for ourselves as education workers, but also for the broader school communities that we're a part of, then we will not have the power to defend ourselves against the efforts to privatize our schools, to subject us to further austerity, all of which we know is coming down the pike during the COVID crisis. Most recently, we ran for leadership earlier this year. Unfortunately, we did come up short, but we did double our support within our union. So now we have a base of 3,000 members of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers who have our backs and who share Working Educators' vision for our union and for our schools. And we don't just fight during election years, we fight year round. So whether it's fighting for demands that students are putting forward, or whether it's working in coalition with other public sector workers who are also going to be under attack during this period, we don't stop our organizing.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Tiba, what do you have to say about all of that?
So hi, my name is Tonya Bahwill, and everyone calls me Tiba. I am a Philadelphia public school graduate, a 54-year-old Black Italian, recognizing my light skin privilege, and mother of autistic twins here in Philadelphia's public schools. So what I want to say first is, as a result of the existence of the Caucus of the Working Educators, which I am a part of through the parent portion, parents actually have a voice and have a say and have support around the issues that challenge our city, definitely challenge our freedom, challenge our children, challenge their ability to understand and communicate their understanding. So I came into the caucus, the WE Caucus, Working Educators, as a result of my children being at one of the public schools and realizing that there were standardized tests that were imposed upon them. One who is not only autistic, but is also nonverbal with hydrocephalus and cerebral palsy. So he has a complete and full IEP, individual education plan. As a result of the Caucus of Working Educators, I met a member who discussed how the standardized tests were being used to privatize, to close our schools, to grade and label our children in such a way that it was very harmful and damaging. And while I had never considered myself an activist, I became one a minute after realizing what was going on. The school that my daughter attended, where the standardized tests, my daughter and my son, where the standardized tests were being imposed, was also a school that had about 500 students from 6th grade to 8th, with very challenging situations at home. And we have had suicides, of course, dropouts, situations where there's been sexual assault, and having the support of the largest, or one of the largest unions in the city of Philadelphia, to speak out and speak up about the issues that perpetuate the oppressive conditions in our communities is powerful. And so I considered myself a very reserved and shy person, but as a parent, with the support of the educators, and being a former Philadelphia public school graduate, school was always a safe space for me. My teachers were always an extension of my family, and the ability to articulate what's going on to me, with my children, with their studies, with their challenges and disabilities, directly with the educators, is and was powerful. The working educators have challenged everything from public education, incarceration, sexual assault. Like it just goes through a list of challenging situations that any major union or any major group in the city should be looking at, should be addressing, and should be lifting up. And that is what the Caucus of the Working Educators provided. That was not in Philadelphia, in a way where parents and actual everyday community members had a place. So,
Tiba, can I also ask you all to briefly say something about all of this and the school to prison pipeline, the way that WE Caucus deals with it, and what you see going forward in this COVID and economic crisis? Either one of you, Dan or Tiba.
Dan.
Sure. I mean, well, I think an important way to think about the school to prison pipeline is part of the broader pattern of austerity. Rather than figuring out how we can build a society that provides people with their essential needs, that allows people to live a dignified life, instead of dealing with the contradictions of neoliberal capitalism, which says if you can't work, then you have no value, rather than building a society like that, we take all the folks who have been pushed out by transformations made to the economy, especially in Philadelphia. We used to have a huge manufacturing sector. All of that has gone, in large part due to the organized nature of the Black working class in Philadelphia. Many of those firms left. And so as a result, rather than dealing with the mass unemployment in a way that built a better society, instead we create prisons. And so that is reflected, those priorities are reflected in our schools by virtue of the fact that we put more emphasis on having a police presence in schools and having harsh punitive disciplinary policies. Even when the district has made sort of aesthetic changes to these policies, that's still been the lived reality for a number of students. Rather than having the support staff that are really necessary, having social workers, having counselors, having sufficient school nurses, having therapists on site in every school building, for every day, we've chosen to have a system that instead punishes children for the conditions that they're living in, that focuses those punitive measures on Black and brown children. When really what we need is a massive reinvestment in our schools that would involve having wraparound support services for our students, recognizing that we can't solve all of the problems that students are facing in schools, but schools are an important place to begin that process and to model what that should look like. So Working Educators takes the position that rather than funding more cops in schools, that what we really need are having a much lower student to therapist, student to counselor, student to nurse ratio, so that students have access to all the basic health care. And then I include mental health when I say healthcare, at the school building that they need to feel safe and healthy. And then beyond that, pushing within our buildings and at the district level for policies that are not punitive, moving away from a disciplinary approach to a restorative justice approach. For example, at my high school that I work at, we have implemented an approach that's really designed to try to make suspension something that virtually never happens. And what's key to that is making sure that all teachers have other teachers that they can lean on for support when they're having trouble with a student. So the first step isn't to just push someone down to the main office. The first step isn't to call a school resource officer up to the room. The first step is to go to a teacher that you know can support you, that you know has a good relationship with a student, and use that as a way to work through an issue that you're having in a way that isn't punitive, that doesn't put the student closer to being pushed out of the school, but instead really recognizes the humanity of that student, and builds a system that works around that. So
Thank you, Dan.
yeah.
I'm gonna ask Matt to wrap it up. He's a retired New York City public school teacher, but Tiba, any thoughts?
Just the fact that the Caucus of Working Educators membership recognizes all the trauma that comes into the classroom. And like what Dan was saying, there is a restorative attitude towards it and not a punitive response that just further traumatizes not just the student, but the entire family. So,
And the entire community.
And the entire community.
Thank you, Tiba. Matt, turning over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. I want to say something that really shifts us to the conversation about prison. And we have two extremely distinguished guests who are able to talk about that. But more than that, I think there are 2 points I want to make about the school stuff. First of all, as the son of a founder of the United Federation of Teachers, my dad was a chapter leader in the 60s, working with Albert Shanker. As someone who, as you said, Wendy, was in the school system for decades myself, I was a chapter leader when I was a high school teacher, and worked as I watched in New York City over the decades, less and less services for students. I want to first say that what we did, what the Working Educators Caucus in Philadelphia did and does, even though you were not technically victorious at winning control over the entire union in Philly, as we had hoped you would do, what you have done in this key 2019-2020 context is show that alternatives and resistance is possible and is powerful and is dynamic and is student-centered. And so everything that Tiba and Daniel and Wendy, you guys have talked about and you guys have shared and you guys have done over the last year and especially these intense months really gives the rest of us and the rest of the country a lot of hope about the possibilities of building alternate student-centered education, even in this current difficult moment. So, what does the nature of public schooling, the nature of imprisonment, and COVID-19 have in common? Well, the answer is sadly clear, even in a country that talks about democracy. Containment is the common factor. The idea that instead of building places where we could actually think critically and creatively, or maybe places where people who have had some difficulty can be reformed and rehabilitated, or maybe looking at a health pandemic, a global and national health pandemic, and getting us healthy, instead the emphasis on keeping people contained, keeping people in boxes, and the more you want to resist the boxes, the more they want to throw away the key. So we're going to move from looking at the ways in which everything that we and Tiba and Dan stand for in terms of student-centered education is the opposite of what's happening in schooling. And so when, in fact, young people don't like the system that is miseducating or not educating them and rebel, the next step is the prison house. That's what we think of, and that's what we do to youth, especially youth who may be the most rebellious. So we're going to start off this next section with one more song. It's the second and last song, and we want to thank Dave Lippman, a long-term singer-songwriter, for his incredible singing. And also, in this case, it's an older song, Apartment Quarantine is a brand new one. But this one is an older song we're going to share that nonetheless has been given some new videos, and it's looking at the most special kind of prisoner, the prisoners that we're going to have, former prisoners we're going to have coming up and talk to us, Sekou and Jihad, U.S. political prisoners.
Computer programmer was my occupation. I heard about civil rights down in the South. I could not keep my mind on my program. I had to use my heart and my mouth. I lived in Harlem, I was Black Panther. I looked for answers for my people. I am not famous, I'm not Mandela, but I am imprisoned in a jail. My name is Sundi Ata Akoli, and my soul is not for sale. They call me terrorist for conspiring against the government and companies who strip, mine, pollute, and destroy. In Puerto Rico they do as they please. They like to talk about freedom fighters, but not in their own backyard. They took my sister and me, we're doing 83, and there will be no bail. My name is Ida Luz Rodriguez, and my country's not for sale. Down at the market, no one talks about it. On the TV, you won't see this tale, but if you can see me, then they must free me. So won't you please lift up the veil? Driving cabs is a good way to pay the rent for a journalist who tells the truth. They've been after me since I've been after them. No, I did not waste my youth. In Philadelphia, police won't help ya, except to beat you to the punch. They beat my brother, there was another, shot the policeman, but I'm doing the time. My name is Mumia Abu Jamal, and the system is the crime. Once proud nations reduced to reservations, government goons come to terrorize. We had a duty to defend our family from corruption, guns, and lies. The FBI came, they played that old game, divide and conquer to maintain their power. I'm not famous, I'm not Mandela, but I am imprisoned in a jail. My name is Leonard Peltier, and this land is not for sale. Down at the market, no one talks about it. On the TV, you won't see this tale, but if you can see me, then they must free me. So won't you please lift up the veil? If you can see me, then they must free me. So won't you please lift up the veil?
So this is Matt Meyer again with Wende Marshall, recording for People's Strike, May Day 2020, special show and programming on Schools to Prison Pipeline. We are extremely honored to have not one but two former U.S. political prisoners. First up, the amazing, really the legendary Sekou Odinga, who spent over 30 years tortured in the worst of the U.S. gulags. Sekou was a leader of the Black Panther Party here in New York City. He was part of the Panther 21. He was part of the BLA. He was a part of the Panther International. And here to talk to us about his experiences, but also about the continued incarceration of political prisoners and political people. Welcome, Sekou Odinga.
Okay, thank you, Matt. As Matt said, my name is Sekou Abdulmumit Odinga. I was a political prisoner here in the U.S. Well, actually, I call myself a political prisoner of war because the former slaves here in the U.S. I was captured in 19 offenses. I was found guilty in 2 jurisdictions, the New York State jurisdiction and attempt murder of police, and given 25 years to life. And in the federal jurisdiction, given a system of aiding in the liberation of Assata Shakur and expropriation of an armored truck. We didn't think those were criminal acts because we felt that we were in a legitimate struggle for national liberation of New African people here on the shores of the U.S., which I still believe that I believe that African people was declared war on when they were attacked, kidnapped, and illegally brought across the ocean to be enslaved here on the shores of the U.S. That fight started then and it continues today. We've never stopped. Those of us who have clearly made it a political decision to struggle against that are the ones that we usually call political prisoners. Because of our political activities, our political views, our political rhetoric, the government has singled us out and not only attacked us, but murdered, arrested, tortured, etc. When I was captured, I was tortured for 6 hours. I was beaten, I was burned with cigars, my toenail was ripped out, my head was shoved in flushing toilets in an attempt to get me to tell them where other people were at. That's the type of actions that are saved for political prisoners. That kind of separates us from the so-called social prisoner. When I was found guilty in prison, instead of going to a normal prison, I was sent to what at that point time was considered the most secure and hard prison in the U.S. in the federal system was Marion, Illinois. It was a lockdown at that time it was locked down 24 hours a day. You was in your cell all day. We was let out 3 times a week for showers, 10-minute showers. I went straight there from court. I was flown into the prison on a helicopter that had never been done before. So that's what I mean when I say political prisoner rather than a social prisoner. We're separated not only with the prisons that we're sent to, but the time that we're given and the way we're treated while we're there. We have a number of political prisoners still in prison today from our movement way back in the 60s and 70s. We have people like Chip Fitzgerald, who's been in prison for 50 years. People like Jalil Mutakim, who has been in prison for 48, 49 years. Prisoners like Matulu Shakur has been in prison over 30 years. We have a number of political prisoners still in the U.S. Not only are there Black political prisoners, we have Native American political prisoners, we have foreign political prisoners. We have a large number of foreign political prisoners, mostly of Arab descent in this prison system that we never hear about or see. The only ones that most of us have heard about are the ones that were arrested for so-called trade building bombing. They're all in this federal system at this point. But there are many others that are picked up in the streets of Beirut, in the streets of Palestine, in the streets of Afghanistan, in the streets of Iraq and other places, who they claim were supporters of terrorists. They bring them over here, put them on trial, and lock them up. And we don't know nothing about them. We never hear about them coming over here. I only know about them because I saw them and met many of them while I was in the prison system myself. The United States has been a political gulag, or a country that has political gulag since the beginning of the states, or at least ever since the so-called slaves were emancipated. We find that most of these jails started to lock up runaway slaves, to re-enslave the so-called emancipated slaves, to lock them up and then let them out as free as labor for prisoners. These how these prisons really started, and they continue today. We still have slavery is only considered legal in the U.S. in the prison system, and there's many of them that are enslaved in there. So I think that it's important that we understand that there are a lot of political prisoners in this country, and that we, as a people, disavow that, make it clear that we don't support that, make it clear through our actions, through our activity, through our organizing, to free our political prisoners. We have prisoners like Sundiata Acoli, who's 83 years old, who's been in prison almost 50 years, who in this COVID-19 time is at a very big risk of dying in prison if he contacts. And we're hearing that he's sick right now. So we have other political prisoners that are elderly. All of our political prisoners mostly are elderly. When I say elderly, all of them are over 60. You know,
Brother Sekou, I want to say just the way I said about the We Caucus, but in a different way, in some ways a deeper way. You know, your story and your reflections, you know, are one of the best symbols of ongoing, actual, and possible resistance we have today. I think most of us feel like the reason political imprisonment continues and the reason these brothers and some sisters have stayed in prison is not just because of what they did, but more than anything, the symbol of who they are and what they represent as movement leaders. So I want to flip things a little bit. You're talking about still existing political prisoners, and you know, one of the leading organizations that does work to free all the political prisoners is the National Jericho Movement. Sekou, you're part of the Northeast Political Prisoner Coalition, but we have the national chair of the National Jericho Movement here, also a former political prisoner, and we want to hear from some of the visions and some of the work being done to increase the resistance today. Brother Jihad Abdulmumit.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. And thank you, Wendy, and my comrade, brother Sekou Odinga. Yeah, again, my name is Jihad Abdulmumit. I'm the chairperson of the National Jericho Movement, jerichomovement.com, easily accessed on the internet there for more information. And just picking up with my comrade Sekou was saying, moving forward, like what we tried to do is give logistical and direct support to political prisoners in campaigns to get them free from prison. And that's what Sekou was talking about. One of the founders of the Jericho Movement, a brother by the name of Jihad Abdulmumit, who is still incarcerated on his 48th year or so in prison in the state of New York, and was also the co-founders for Safia Bukhari and Herman Ferguson. Both of those dear loved people have passed away since then. But Jericho was started in 1998. But our focus along is to free all political prisoners. And there was a call given by Jalil Abdulmumit a year or so ago to organize a coalition to try to bring all the wonderful people and organizations that work to free political prisoners and give them support and encouragement in their captivity. He called for a coalition which called In the Spirit of Nelson Mandela. And everybody knows Nelson Mandela. He was a champion of the world, South Africa, in prison, you know, for 28 or so years in South Africa. And we get much inspiration. So by calling it In the Spirit of Nelson Mandela, we're bringing in the realization that we have Nelson Mandela's right here in the shores of the United States of America. One of the things that this coalition is working on is a tribunal, and there's been tribunals before, but this is an international tribunal scheduled for October 2021. I'm glad it's in 2021 because we don't know what the scourge of the COVID-19 pandemic is going to cause on any scheduling, but right now, October 2021. And what we're doing is we're networking and building a network and organizing with other organizations, you know, to bring real charges against the United States with the purpose of getting some resolve, some resolutions across the board nationally, and how we can address these problems, and all the way from mass incarceration to disproportionate rates of people of color in prison, of course, political prisoners and their freedom, decimation of the planet. So those type of crimes, police brutality on blacks, even though the coronavirus pandemic has kind of obscured all other news going on, but it is still going on, and the conditions of poverty and exploitation and marginalization and the lack of medical care and access is still going on in communities across the United States. COVID-19 pandemic has proven that even more so, actually. But we're calling on all listeners and to really tune into these efforts. The best way to contact us now, given the pandemic, is to, you know, access our website, nationaljerichomovement.com, or my name, Jihad Abdulmumit, at Gmail. At this point now, we're about 14 or 15 months away, so a lot of organizing being done. But I want you to really pick up on this beautiful vision of making a massive network, you know, across the United States, where organizations that deal with these critical issues we have a clearinghouse and coming together to really be able to put more power and focus on our efforts, because indeed there are plenty of wonderful, beautiful activists across the country and organizations. But the United States is a big country. You know, we're talking about 325 million people. it's not like a small African country as such, or in the Middle East. You know, there's many different diversities and many different interests. So we really have to find a way to bring all of this together, you know, as a clearinghouse, you know, where we can really come to some resolve in dealing with these issues, including freeing our political prisoners. So the political prisoner piece is a central component of this tribunal, and bringing world attention to it. We're organizing jurists to come from across around the world. It's supposed to be held in New York City. There'll be more information. Like I said, we're 15 months out, but this is a very important endeavor. But moving to that point, and I'll conclude in a minute, what we need to do with the political prisoners, we need to categorize exactly who they are, you know, and see what their special needs is, because really this COVID-19 is presenting an opportunity now for prisoners that are, like Sekou mentioned, Sundiata Kohli, 83 years old. You know, prisoners have been in jail for almost 5 decades or more, you know, to get released, even if it's under the auspices of the pandemic, which is real. But they should be released anyway. But now we have more opportunities. So we're calling on everybody to really tune in on the many different Zoom meetings and what's happening in your community. You can tune into us, what's we're presenting to you right now. And if you want to know how and why political prison is so important, when we talk about the articulation of our struggle and our history, we're talking about Mumia Abu-Jamal. When we're talking about community development, we're talking about brothers like Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, and what he's done all the way from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to SNCC, all the way up until the time of his unfortunate arrest and capture. When you talk about organizing in prisons, we're talking about Jihad Abdulmumit himself, dating this all the way back to George Jackson himself, and all the issues that go on in prison. When we're talking about the courage to endure and the strength to be free, we're talking about Russell Maroon Shells. When we're talking about indigenous people and our rights and our connection with them in the land, we're talking about Leonard Peltier. When we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about Dr. Batulu Shakur. All these are political prisoners. When we talk about anti-imperialists and those people of different nationalities come together to bring some humanity to society, we're talking about Jan Lyman and brothers like David Gilbert. And so we're talking about political prisoners being the genuine connection between any activism that exists today, any activism, any organization. Whatever we're doing, we cannot just start today and move forward. We're talking about drawing strength from our roots, and there's no better genuine way to draw strength from our roots than to support those political prisoners that are in jail now that made those supreme sacrifices with their life and all the way up to the tune of 5 decades of prison. So I thank you for the time, and hopefully this is some type of light into why the issue of political prison is important. Support the upcoming information and initiative with the International Tribunal for 2021. We're calling that IT 2021, and you can stay tuned with this. And even when we talked earlier about the schools and prison pipeline that was on another segment, how can you really circumvent that? You circumvent that by supporting those people that put in their work to try to really change that. Because anybody that does anything today that ends up in prison or whatever the case, it'd be horrible to even contemplate the fact that they would be abandoned by us today. And so we don't want to give that message. We want to support those that have given their life and their time and their sacrifice in being in prison. So we challenge you and encourage you to support these efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jihad, Sekou. Thank you for reminding us the debt that we owe you, and the ways in which our struggles rest on your shoulders, as it does with the ancestors. I want to introduce Kenyatta Thompson, who's staff at the Katal Project, to talk about efforts of prison abolitionism in the times of COVID. And Kenyatta, you're muted. Yep, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I even begin, I just want to say what an honor it is to even go after Sekou and Jihad. So thank you both for the work that you've done. Just like you introduced, Wendy, my name is Kenyatta Thompson. I'm a lead community organizer with the Katal Center for Health, Equity, and Justice, working in both Connecticut, where I reside, and New York as well. And so just really briefly, what Katal is for folks who are listening in. We're a community organizing group devoted to developing the leadership of people and building power. Full stop. That's what it is. So prior to COVID hitting, we've been working on a number of different initiatives to ensure that people are released from incarceration and that folks aren't even entering the carceral state at any point. So some of the stuff that we've been doing in New York are trying to get out people who have been incarcerated for technical parole violations. We're trying to do a similar bill in Connecticut to introduce a bill to get people out of incarceration for technical probation and parole violations. We've also done a lot of work to scale back a piece of legislation in Connecticut that criminalizes people for using and selling fentanyl, which we know is another iteration of the drug war. So we've been really trying to get as many people out of incarceration as we can through a number of different initiatives. But since COVID, the big elephant in the room, we've had to really just double down on that work to get as many people out as we can. The latest figures, I think, from the New York Times state that the 10 top places where there are clusters of COVID-19 are happening in prisons and jails throughout the country. We already know that prisons and jails are a public health crisis. You add COVID into that, and the fire gets lit. And no one deserves to die in jail. No one deserves to die in prison. Similarly, no one deserves to die in prison or jail due to COVID-19, but unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. So I just want to share a little bit of what we've been doing in New York and Connecticut, just to let folks know some of the initiatives that we've done. So once COVID really hit, we decided to put out a number of different statements, both in Connecticut and New York. I'll start with New York, though, calling on Governor Cuomo to use his executive power to release as many people as possible. So initially we asked to get people who were medically susceptible for COVID-19, but since then we've changed it just to release as many people as possible as we're seeing what's happening. If you look at the rate on Rikers, that has some of the highest rates of positive COVID cases more than any other place in the state. So Governor Cuomo said that he would release at least 1,100 people, so 1,100 people. He said that in late March. As of earlier this month, April 10th, half of the number of people that he was supposed to release on Rikers had been released. So he was supposed to release 400 people, and we're only seeing half of that. And that's also evident throughout the entire state of New York. So just to let you know, presently, docs in New York stated that there are 300 incarcerated people who have tested positive for COVID-19, and of that, and outside of that number, a little more than that, there are over 1,000 staff who have tested positive for COVID-19. So we're just seeing in New York that we need to get out as many people as we can. So what we've done in response to all of this is we've created an online tool where folks can safely tweet, email, and call their elected officials to ensure that incarcerated people are released, which you can find on our website under the action section called Free Them Now. So we're trying to find safe ways to let people out in a way where folks don't expose themselves to catching COVID-19. In Connecticut, the situation is slightly similar, but there are a lot of differences. So presently in Connecticut, as of today, there are 417 incarcerated people who have tested positive and 326 DOC staff who have tested positive, which just shows that this is a major issue. Our governor in Connecticut, Governor Lamont, has not committed to mass releasing incarcerated people. And there have been a number of releases made, but a lot of those releases were happening prior to COVID-19. Many of those folks were end of sentence, and they've stopped several new admissions into the prisons and jails, which is really good. But again, over time, we're seeing an increase in the number of incarcerated people who are being tested positive for COVID, and we're seeing a lot of inaction from the governor in terms of getting as many people out. So we created a similar online tool for Connecticut where you can email and tweet, and eventually you'll be able to call your elected official to ask them to get out. But again, we got to put power in the people's hands. And so once we realized that Governor Lamont was not listening to Katal and a myriad of community groups and just community members on the ground calling for incarcerated people to be released, we've staged several digital press conferences. We've had in-person press conferences where we're being COVID safe. We've done safe car actions outside of the governor's mansion and outside of different prison facilities throughout the state of Connecticut to let folks who are incarcerated know that we are there, we are fighting for you, we're making sure that we're doing everything that we can, but also to just let the governor know that we're not stopping. This has been our work at Katal prior to COVID-19 to get as many people out. But again, we're seeing this fire where incarcerated people are just testing positive for COVID-19 left and right. And unfortunately, we're watching our loved ones pass away due to COVID-19. And that is a public health crisis and something that could have been avoided if states were able to stand up and actually release as many incarcerated people as possible. We're seeing precedents set in other countries. Iran released over 7,000 of their incarcerated population. Turkey has released several thousands of their incarcerated population. And yet here in the United States, we just cannot get it together because we have elected officials who are not using their executive authority to release incarcerated people. So, you know, again, we heard from the elders before me, Sekou and Jihad, who talked about the plight of political prisoners who are incarcerated and the different things that folks have gone through. All of this is still happening while COVID-19 is ravaging our prisons and jails. So again, at Katal, this was our work prior to COVID-19. We're going to continue doing this work moving forward. So if folks want to sign up and take some of our online actions, if they're unable to join in some of the in-person, and again, we're doing COVID safe actions. So we're ensuring that folks have PPE. If it's a car action, we're asking folks to stay in their cars or sit on top of it. If we have the press conferences, we're asking folks to stand as far away from as possible. So if folks want to join in, whether they're the online actions or the in-person actions, they can find more information at our website, katalcenter.org, KATALCENTER.org. And you can just sign up and you'll probably get a phone call from me just saying, let's build power together.
Thank you, Kenyatta. You know, when we talk about May Day 2020 and we talk about People's Strike, we think about all of the issues that all of our panelists this last hour have raised. And we have to wonder, looking at the political scene, reading the headlines, looking at what's happening in DC, whether in fact we live in anything that could resemble something called a democracy. It seems that that word is extremely misplaced when we talk about the USA in 2020. However, when we hear from someone like you, Kenyatta Thompson, and we hear about the work of the Katal Institute, you know, there's a reason why Wende Marshall and I thought that you would bat cleanup, as we say in baseball terms, and be the final speaker, because it gives us hope and it gives us vision for the kind of fight back and the kind of work that we need to be doing, and we need to be doing together for all of us. So I'll just say, and then Wende, you can close it up for us. Thank you, Kenyatta, Jihad, Sekou. Thank you, Daniel and Tiba. Thank you, Wende. And thank you, all of you. We realize that May Day 2020 is a special day because of the work that Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi and a coalition of thousands of groups have begun to put into play. But we also realize that unlike other May Days, this is not a one-day thing. It's not even a special day thing. It's a launch of what has to be an expanding and ever-growing people's movement that spreads for the first of every month and spreads until we have real people's power. So all power to the people. Wende, close us up.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. I simply want to say that we should all remember that we have nothing to lose but our chains, all of us.